Thank you for my warm welcome as usual, and it's good to be here in your old church, because there are some things that I want you to make sure that you take to your new church. There are some things that are indissolubly yours, and it's partly the warmth and friendliness of the congregation, and I hope that transplants to, is it Woodhouse something? Mansfield Woodhouse, that's the place. I've seen it on signs, I have no idea where it is, but I hope I can find it next time. Now, you're going to need your Bibles open to John's Gospel, chapter 6. I'm going to read the first 21 verses, and we shall not stray very far from these verses today. John's Gospel, chapter 6. Start at verse 1, a good place to begin. After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went, because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill. Now, we are assuming that he's reached the other side. He's taken a boat 5 miles across Galilee. Then Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. That was in Jerusalem, of course, but it gives the time of year as about March. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, "Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?" He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough food to feed all these people." Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Look, what good is that with this huge crowd?" "Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. Incidentally, on the far side of Galilee, the slopes are not grassy except during March. It's after the former rains and before the sun has bleached all the landscape blonde, really. Rather like my lawn before the rains came a couple of weeks ago. Then there it says the men alone numbered 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. In verse 12, after everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." Now jump to verse 14. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is a prophet, the one we've been expecting." When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away quietly into the hills by himself. That evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him. Remember, they'd come in the boat. They needed to return in the boat. But as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake towards Capernaum. Soon a gale swept down upon them, and the sea grew very rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat. So the very element that was threatening to be over their heads was under the feet of the master. They were terrified. But he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Then they were eager to to let him into the boat, and immediately they reached their destination. When God repeats himself, it's not because he's run short of things to say. It's for emphasis. So when we find that he's repeated this particular story in all four Gospels, different words, of course, but same stories, then we know there's some point in there that he wants you to get hold of, that he wants us to understand. And I wondered what it was, and I've reached this conclusion. It's not about the work of Jesus, it's not about the mission of Jesus, but this story is about the person of Jesus. And it is in the person of Jesus, known and loved by his disciples, by us, that we find the solution to all of life's problems. Now, I want to begin with verse 5. When Jesus has reached the other side, he's come really for peace and quietness to talk to his disciples, but a huge crowd has found him. Jesus saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him, and turning to Philip, he said, "Where shall we buy bread to feed all these people?" Well, there was no source of bread anywhere near, but Philip came from Bethsaida. Now, this crowd had come all the way from Capernaum. They'd watched Jesus. It was obviously a clear day. They'd watched him cross the lake. And they had gone all the way up to Bethsaida, which was in the extreme north of the Sea of Galilee. And then they'd followed him down the other side. And they must have taken maybe 2-3 hours to do that. But they'd caught up with him in the end. But there's no food sources nearby. But if there were any, Philip would know. And the reason Philip would know was because he came from Bethsaida. So it was the last town they'd passed. And Jesus said, "What do you make of this problem, Philip? What would you do about it?" And Philip says, "Well, send them away. Make them solve the problem for themselves. Make them fend for themselves." He treated the problem as if Jesus were not God unlimited, and he allowed the problem to eclipse the master. Whereas if he'd known and loved the master would have eclipsed the problem. But we can understand Philip because we've been a bit like this ourselves in many ways. When we walk with Jesus, it's not a sort of hand-in-hand walk with Jesus looking after all of our comforts. There's something that he puts higher on his agenda than our comforts. And it's our growth as people, not physically, but spiritually and psychologically too, for that matter. He wants us to grow, and we grow as we are tested. And Philip was being tested here, but he failed it because he didn't know the master, not well enough. He hadn't realized yet that Jesus was God unlimited. And really, on the eve of the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus still had to say to Philip, "After all these years with me, Philip, you still don't know who I am?" But Philip was like that. He was slow to learn. And Jesus didn't tell him off. He didn't wipe the floor with him or anything like that. He just waited to see what anybody else might say. And it says in verse 8, "Then Andrew, Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a young boy here who's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good is that with this huge crowd?" Now, when we have the image in our mind of barley loaves, we think of the ones we pick up at Sainsbury's. I pick up 3 on Wednesdays, and they last us all week. And they're about that size and about that. But these loaves were not like that. This was a pocket full of food that this boy had. And these were rolls, barley bread, but rolls, quite small. 5 of them would fit in his pocket. And the fish were fish fragments, possibly even, or not certainly, possibly salted. So they were just a pocket full of food. This boy had left home that morning, and his mother had said, "Look, we probably won't see you before supper time, so have this food to keep you going during the day." I had a mother who used to do things like that. I lived in a society where you could be let loose in the morning and not expected home until 6 o'clock in the evening. But if you weren't there by 6, you were in trouble. But I had something to keep me going in the daytime. That boy had, and he'd come forward to Andrew and said, "Have this." He wanted to do what he could with what he had. And I admire him for that. And if this story has a hero apart from Jesus, it is the small boy who offers the contents of the pocket in what I shall imagine is his anorak, and gives it to Andrew for Jesus to use. He wants to do what he can with what he has. Now, often when we see human need on a massive scale, we just panic. What can I do about that? What can I do? We had, what was it, Cox's Bazaar, they called it, on the edge of Burma and Bangladesh. There were masses and masses and masses of people. And I had somebody say, "What can we do about that?" And she meant the country. But of course there are things that we can do. And that little boy knew that. He could do what you can with what you have. And that's what was done. And he did it really by faith. He had faith that Jesus would perform the miracle. He would take the food, and I'm sure he didn't expect it that it would be the only source of food, but it was, of course. Faced with raw human need, we need to do what we can with what we have. But it's interesting what Jesus does. He gives a command, verse 10. Tell everybody to sit down. You can imagine Philip saying, "Sit down? What on earth for?" It's the last thing they should be doing. They need to be running to the nearest branch of Tesco's. They don't want to be sitting down. But they were miles away from Bethsaida, even if they had a branch of Tesco's. And it was maybe 7, 8, 9 miles from the nearest township. So Jesus had a sense of, what do we call it now? A duty of care, shall we say that? He had a duty of care. He felt he had a duty of care. Somehow he had to feed these people. That's why he'd asked the question to Philip in the first place. Jesus needed to feed this vast crowd because regardless of what their motives were, they wanted to see Jesus. Otherwise they wouldn't have been there. But ill-advisedly, they have walked a long way from the nearest food source. But Jesus has not forgotten them, and he wants to do something about it. And he gives this order, let the people sit down. Now, the best way to increase faith is always to obey. And Andrew and Philip, although they had their faults, they loved their master. And they obeyed. They made the people sit down. And as it says, 5,000 of them were men. It doesn't say how many women and children there were, but quite a few more, I would imagine. But we don't need to worry about the problem in the sense that it was just a vast crowd. If we understand that, that's something. Jesus doesn't give an explanation of what he's going to do. He doesn't issue a white paper or a strategic plan or anything of that sort. He doesn't tell them what he's going to do, but the boy has come forward with this food. And it is food, and what is needed is food, and Jesus multiplies this food many times over, having blessed it. Jesus doesn't want inspired strategies from us. He wants faith and obedience. We can all make that boy a model, really, for our own behavior. Faith and obedience, not necessarily inspired strategies. That boy wanted to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And that's a good attitude of mind for us to have. But Jesus doesn't perform his miracle unless he's given a command. This is many times the case. He said once, roll away the stone. This was the graveside of Lazarus. And no, we don't roll away the stone. Lord, he's been there for 4 days. Verily, somebody said, he stinketh. roll away the stone. And then at Cana in Galilee, fill the water pots with water. It's not water we want, Lord. It's wine. We've run out of wine. Fill the water pots with water. And here it's make the people sit down. The real proof of love is always obedience. The evidence that someone has found Christ is always an obedient spirit. I had a father who was very extrovert, very loud. And when he praised the Lord, he was very loud. He had what he called his squash box. And my sister and I didn't necessarily approve of all of his loud praises. And so he went into a different room. But he used to sing, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus than to trust and obey. And, we'd pay a lot of money to hear him sing it now, but we never did record him. We just ran away. Trust and obey, that is the thing. Jesus didn't despise the small boy's small gift. And don't imagine the boy was unaware that his gift was trivial and small. Of course he knew that. He wasn't stupid. Little boys are not stupid, nor little girls for that matter. And he did what he could with what he had. But that small boy was wiser than Philip and Andrew. He was prepared to make a gift of what he had. He proffered it rather than offered it, because it was his lunch. So he proffered it. He wanted to share it. It's a good attitude of mind to have. He looked at the throng of people and said, have this. And this proved to be enough, and more than enough. Could it be that you and I think of ourselves as too big, too important? I caught this theme really at the end of Sabbath school as well. We need to really have a perception of our smallness, our sinfulness, our folly, and maybe God can make more use of us than he could if we regard ourselves as really rather self-important, It tends to be the case. In the Spirit of Prophecy, there's a wonderful quote that says, from the soul that feels its nothingness, nothing is withheld. Did you get that? From the soul that feels its nothingness, nothing is withheld. Paul said much the same thing. He said, his strength is made perfect in our weakness. In other words, when we're at our most vulnerable, when we acknowledge our own weakness, our own folly, that is when God's strength is maximized for us. That is something that we need to keep in mind. In the book Testimonies, volume 5, page 48, and I found this when I was looking for something else, to be honest, but it took me by surprise. It said, are you in Christ? And it says, not if you do not acknowledge yourselves as erring, helpless, condemned sinners. And I thought, that's one for me at the moment. And she goes on to say, the Laodicean tragedy, remember the 7 churches, Laodicea was the last, is not their disease, it's the fact they think they're well. I'm okay, I don't need anything. That was the attitude of mind that they had. Notice verse 12, where it says, it's at the end of verse 11, it says, and they all ate as much as they wanted. And verse 12 begins, after everyone was full. What is the limit of God's goodness, God's gifts, God's graciousness to us? When everyone was full. But I think we mustn't miss out verse 14. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, surely he's the prophet we've been expecting. And Jesus had to get away rather quickly because they wanted to use force to make him their king. But in the hymn that we sang at the beginning of the service, and this is why I chose the hymn, there is the expression prophet and priest and king, but there was no mention of a priest. The Laodiceans didn't want a priest. A priest was somebody associated with sacrifice, and the sacrifice Jesus was offering was himself. And they weren't about to admit that they were sinners, that they had spiritual needs. They wouldn't admit that. And they wanted a prophet like this. Well, of course, he would foresee the enemy's strategy in advance. And a king like this would be able to speak armies into existence, horses and chariots and all kinds of armaments, not to mention foodstuffs as well. A prophet like this could be made a king, and he could really dislodge the Romans from Jerusalem, as Judas Maccabeus a couple of hundred years before had dislodged the Greeks. This is the sort of king they were looking for, and they thought they'd found one in Jesus. And this was his big opportunity, politically speaking. But Jesus was not interested in politics, and nor should we be, not that much anyway. I need to mention that at a union session sometime, because we do think politically more than we should. They wanted a Christ of their own, in their own image, a Christ who was, could perform miracles and had great power, but on their own terms somehow. They didn't want a Christ who come to offer himself as a sacrifice for sin. Now, I want to just spend just a few minutes before we finish on verses 16 to 21, because it's possible here that we have a summary of 21 centuries of church history in this. If we look at it as an allegory. Remember that evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him, but as darkness fell, they got into the boat. Now, how do we see church history being fulfilled here? Well, the story had begun at Passover time, when the grass was green. Passover was at the beginning of April. It was the Passover when Jesus offered himself in fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, when God said, I will offer myself a lamb. Jesus was the Lamb of God. This was the time of the cross, the beginning of Christian history. But after performing a miracle that made possible mankind's salvation, after 40 days, Jesus disappeared. The ascension, he went back to heaven. He was not there. What did his disciples do? Well, they, in a sense, got into a boat. The boat was called the church, of course, and they put out from the shore, and they soon were in trouble, or after a time they were. A storm came from the Mount Hermon, blowing down the Jordan Valley, churning up the waters so that they felt very, very unsafe. It seemed that they were always rowing against the tide, rowing against the wind. They just couldn't make it. And even though they rowed all night, they'd only made it for 3 or 4 miles, it says. And it was 5 miles to Capernaum. Capernaum, incidentally, means place of consolation. So we know what Capernaum is symbolic of in this story. They got only 3 or 4 miles, and they probably didn't know precisely where they were. They were kind of unsure. They'd been tacking and they'd been changing course. They didn't really know exactly where they were on the journey, because the visibility had gone down to a few yards, and the tempest was strong, and it looks as if any time soon, not only buffeted by storms, they would be actually overcome by the storm, and that was a real possibility. And this is where we have to look at some of the other accounts of this story, where it says that in the 4th watch of the night, this is in Matthew, in the 4th watch of the night between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning, they still were 3 to 4 miles into the journey, but they couldn't reach the shore. But they saw Jesus come, walking on the water, walking on the very element that threatened to be over their heads. He was walking on water. And we have a story in one of the Gospels of Peter. He wanted to do that as well. During my education, I had to cross and recross the estuary of the River Humber a lot of times on a paddle steamer. And the water of the Humber is brown, not like anywhere else, blue, nice bluish colour. It was brown and it looked semi-solid. And at times I wondered if I could give it a go. I could really walk on the water, but thankfully I never tried. But Peter thought, well, he wanted to give it a go. And Jesus didn't discourage him, and he climbed over the gunwales and he walked on water. He walked on water for a while, until, in Matthew's account, it says, until he saw the wind. Nobody ever saw the wind, of course. They saw what the wind did, the consequences of the wind, the whitecaps on the waves, the billows. It reminds me somehow of a journey we once made from Cairn Ryan in Scotland to Larne in Northern Ireland. That's one of the most tempestuous pieces of water. I have known it to be as calm as a mill pond, but the last time we went it was so tempestuous that although we were in a good-sized ferry, the waves were way above the size of the ferry, and we kept slipping down and being brought up again. And of course, we also lost our lunches in the main. It was such an interesting journey. The elements were threatening to be over our heads. So we were in a situation like that when Philip was walking on water. So let's not frown on him too much. In a book written in the early days of the Adventist Church called Early Writings, page 269 to 273, the lady who wrote this said that she thought that at the end of time, just before Jesus comes, there would be a crisis in the church in which some people would leave the church because of an inability to accept what she calls the straight testimony of the risen Christ to the Laodiceans. Now, this is in Revelation 3, of course. What was the straight testimony? Well, he called them poor, blind, naked, miserable, and he also said that they were lukewarm. And he said he could spew them out of his mouth. But he said what they needed was eye salve. The eye salve of spiritual perception. They could get real spiritually, see things as they really are. They needed eye salve. They needed gold, the gold of faith. They needed white raiment, the white raiment of the righteousness of Christ. And this was the contentious part of this message, because Jesus was saying the only way you can be saved is through the perfect righteousness of Christ. But some people think, well, I can do that. I can keep the law. I can tick all the boxes. And you only realize that you can't when you've read the Sermon on the Mount, which brings motives into it. And behavior isn't all of it. It's the complete person. And therefore, you will only ever be saved by the perfect righteousness of Christ. We are saved by works, but they're Christ's works, not ours. Amen. When Peter focused on the storm, he began to trust in his own performance, and he sank and had to be hauled up and put back into the boat. We had a great preacher once in our movement called HMS Richards. I was a boy when he was a relatively old man. But I recall one group discussion that he was a part of, and somebody talked about the righteousness of Christ. And he said, that's the only kind of righteousness there is. And that's been with me ever since. That is the only kind of righteousness there is in an absolute sense. So needed a recovered awareness of the presence of Christ, of the power of Christ, of the person of Christ among us, and is one kind of righteousness, and that's Christ's righteousness. Look upon Jesus, sinless is he. Father, impute his life unto me. Well, what's impute mean? It means attribute. Give. It's part of the justification process. Justification doesn't just involve taking something away, our sins. It means the righteousness of Christ added, covered with his life, whiter than snow, as the hymn says. Final verse, verse 21. Then they were eager to let him in the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. And the word immediately means without passing of time, instantly they reached their destination. Evidently, the final movements were rapid ones, and they reached the place of consolation. For Christ to fulfill his work in the church, he needs to be on board. We need to have his presence, his person, his power amongst us. But the Laodicean message presupposes that Christ is outside that particular church, wanting to get in. Why does he want to get in? He wants to finish the work of the church. They couldn't feed the masses. They couldn't reach the destination. They needed Christ to do it for them. And we need Christ to finish the work in our lives as well, internally. And he needs to take his ransomed people home. And confronted with the problem of feeding the thousands, they couldn't do it. Confronted with the problem of finishing their work, they couldn't do it. Confronted with the task of reaching the shore, they couldn't accomplish it. But the very billows that threatened to be under their feet, over their heads, were under the feet of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 27 says, when God raised him, that is Jesus, from the dead, he placed all things beneath his feet. All things beneath his feet. And in Ephesians chapter 1 verse 22 it says much the same thing. And if you look at the book of Hebrews, you'll find it says the same thing but with different words. But the truth is there. When Christ was raised from the dead, God placed all things beneath his feet. What am I saying to you? There is nothing that threatens to be over your head that is not already under the feet of Jesus. Nothing at all. Our problem is not our problems. It's our unawareness of the person, the presence and the power of Christ, and our unwillingness to let him in. The kingdom does not come by evangelistic strategy, by church board action, by union committee action. The kingdom comes as Christ lives in me, lives in you, and through us has access to the collective life of the church. Thus and only thus does the kingdom come. Church growth and church health are inextricably interconnected. In John's Gospel, no miracle is left without being explained, and Jesus preached a sermon the following day about the bread of life. We'll leave that for another time. But even when he'd finished, they said to him in verse 28, we want to perform the works of God. What should we do? This is chapter 6, verse 28. They replied, we want to perform God's works too. What should we do? And verse 29 says, Jesus told them, this is the only work God wants from you. Believe in the one whom he has sent. Believe in the one he has sent. What he's saying is, unless you have a right relationship with Jesus, and nothing you do will be any good, basically. You can't really obey unless you love me first and last and supremely, unless I'm front and center in your life. God will not accept any works or sacrifices from you until you accept his great sacrifice on your behalf on Calvary. It's a law of life to be confronted with problems too big for us. What happens when the sinful heart prevails is that the problem eclipses the master. One word of encouragement before I finish. In John 19, verses 10 and 11, we find Jesus on trial before Pilate. And Pilate is very frustrated with Jesus. He says, "Don't you know that I have power here to release you or to crucify you?" And in verse 11, Jesus replies, "You would have no power over me at all if it were not permitted from heaven, permitted from above." And that's a truth that is not only applicable in that specific situation, but in all situations in life. Any problem that impacts your life has to be sieved through the great grace and mercy and love of God before it can strike you. And even then, God reserves the right to make it redound to your eternal advantage if you trust in him. When Satan really thinks he's won, like at Calvary, God turns the whole situation round, and the situation works for our eternal benefit. So trust in the person, the presence and the power of Christ. Invite him into the collective life of the church and into our lives as individuals. And all the movements that take place after that will be rapid ones. Wanted, a recovered awareness of the person of Christ, of the presence of Christ, and of the power of Christ. Amen. Amen.